According to 20th century communist philosopher and founding thinker in sociology, Antonio Gramsci, cultural hegemonies are the way that a state, which is to say the systems of power and capital control, or the ruling class, not only justifies and maintains its dominance, but manages to win the active consent of those over whom it rules. This stems from the ruling class maintaining control over different modes of social reproduction, education, media, legal and political means, healthcare provision, and more. In particular, through what we could call civil society, non-state entities. This kind of hegemony is the establishment of what can and cannot be included in an ideology, and thus what the dominant ideology is, and how it will fit the immediate interests of the ruling class. In short, it's the gaps and normals, as put in place by those people with power in a society, a method of control made manifest through making normal happen, with the assumed, coerced, consent of the people. And as we all know, assumed and coercive consent is no consent at all. We should also explore who this Antonio kid was. Antonio Gramsci started his professional life in 1916, working for the Partito Socialista Italiano, the Italian Socialist Party, writing for the paper Avanti, a paper which had just 2 years prior kicked Mussolini out of its editorial lead for his fascism. Within a year, Gramsci had risen to the Provisional Committee of the Socialist Party, and a few years later he'd be a founding member of the Italian Communist Party, representing Italian communism in the International and leading the party when he returned in 1923. 3 years later, he was arrested as Mussolini attacked all opposition, part of a wave of arrests that targeted all opposition, including Gramsci. At that point, a member of parliament. From 1926, his arrest, up until near his death, Gramsci suffered violently from the conditions in prison, but also wrote extensively on philosophy and politics in notebooks that were smuggled to Moscow for publication as the prison notebooks, which we've referenced here today. Let's take a lived example. In his 1998 polemic, Utopia of Endless Exploitation, the Essence of Neoliberalism, French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu describes the current hegemonic state of the world, the dominant discourse in our socio-political order. He points out that neoliberal discourse is not just one discourse among many, rather it is a strong discourse, the way psychiatric discourse is in an asylum. He goes on to explore the way that it is, through a program of symbolic domination, a normalizing ideology. It's not that neoliberal order is an option, instead it is politically, scientifically, economically, mathematically the only option. He evidences his claims using examples from global relations, like multilateral power arrangements, which favor, on the whole, severing the economy from social realities, and thereby constructing in reality an economic system conforming to its description on pure theory. Fundamentally, this sociocultural machine exists to extract from societies the sociocultural, erase its tracks, and leave behind a pure market logic. His perspective is reinforced by philosopher and salty as anything academic Jody Dean, who points out that the left wing has found itself in a kind of I told you so loop over the last 30 or so years, more or less since the so-called end of history. She reinforces the idea that the horrifying economic machine of the neoliberal ideology is an economic machine that operates by redefining an ethical life life in accordance with economic criteria and expectations. Neoliberalism holds that human freedom is best achieved through the operation of markets. Freedom, rather than justice or equality, is, in neoliberalism, the fundamental political value. Dean goes on to describe the construction of neoliberal subjects, those whose symbolic production tees them up to be responsible, neoliberal, economic subjects. All of these perspectives are reinforced by Boris Frankl, who lays out the way that realpolitik, that is, pragmatic rather than ideological politics, in the neoliberal era have fundamentally failed to question the status quo. This status quo order, this dominant discourse, this economic machine, these all describe a state of affairs in which those who hold power in a society, through the control and enforced consent of those around them, have produced this normality that is unquestioned and unquestionable. This, in Gramscian terms, is the current hegemony. However, at no point does Bourdieu use the word. Why is that? Bourdieu's perspective is that cultural hegemony relies too heavily on acquiring the consent of the underclass in order to enact the power of a hegemonic order. As Gramsci explains, quote, "The combination of force and consent in the development of hegemony." Bourdieu's perspective is, instead, that all of this development is enforced by the ruling class without the consent of the underclass being required. Instead, Bourdieu refers to symbolic power or symbolic domination as the nullification of consent, the fundamental control enforced through these institutions of symbolic production, also termed by me institutions of social reproduction, removes the capacity to consent. As a result, a clear set of perspectives do emerge. Firstly, symbolic domination is the thing a hegemony does in a society. That's the process of building and maintaining a hegemony. Secondly, Gramsci's perspective allows for the recognition of hegemony by the underclass and rejection of existing hegemons, while Bourdieu does not believe the underclass have the capacity to recognize that hegemon. Either lens can act as useful perspectives for an analysis of the state of the world, but Bourdieu's perspective is somewhat more defeatist. It accepts the premise of the dominant discourse. This cannot be questioned. There is no alternative. Capitalist realism, is there no alternative, states an ideological position can never be really successful until it is naturalized, and it cannot be naturalized while it is still thought of as a value rather than a fact. Accordingly, neoliberalism has sought to eliminate the very category of value in the ethical sense. Over the past 30 years, capitalist realism has successfully installed a business ontology in which it is obvious that simply everything in society, including healthcare and education, should be run as a business. Mark Fisher famously reiterates and explores the political hegemony of neoliberalism and of late capitalist systems. The clear and straightforward exploration develops our understanding of hegemonies as laid out by Gramsci, built on by explanations from Bourdieu about the normative social systems, and points out the way that capitalism sells back to us the anti-capitalist ideas that would destabilize the control politics that develops the unquestioning malaise of a 21st century capitalist regime. He further points to issues like rising mental health concerns and bureaucratic control over life and lives as illustrations of how the dominant ideology reinforces itself, directing the subject of that hegemony to individualize their illness and fear the theoretical increase of bureaucratic control, while bureaucratic control increases with every new private enterprise within our lives. This reflects the idea that the entirety of the socio-political and economic landscape must be capitalist, reproducing Margaret Thatcher's famous line, "There is no alternative." Fisher asks, is there though? His answer is yes, but to do so we must reflect on the ideology that has been instilled within us and respond with the resistance that is a rival to, not merely oppositional to, capitalist ideologies. And so we come to the only methodology of overcoming the normative system imposed by symbolic domination within cultural hegemony is to imagine a different world and apply critical perspectives in the possible dissection of the world we're in now. Critical analysis as a process requires reviewing the state of the society and asking the question, why? Why is the world like this? What is the perception we hold of the world? According to Frere, quote, "No oppressive order could permit the oppressed to begin to question why," stating that, quote, "It is as transforming and creative beings that humans, in their permanent relations with reality, produce not only material goods, but also social institutions, ideas, and concepts." All in all, the application of critical thinking, critical literacies, and critical analysis, which Frere is one of the founding theorists for, is the process of overcoming hegemony in the cultural order. Through the process of asking why, we therefore imagine a world. We create a world without that hegemonic order, and we produce the alternative.